Friends of the channel are well aware of the concept of institutionalized patriarchy. Men are socialized under unique pressures to conform both body and mind to its competitive, disciplined, and ultimately inhuman status quo. They can be pushed to either complete emotional numbness or absolute rage-induced depravity, or both. But where did institutionalized patriarchy come from, and why haven't we been able to shake their oppressive expectations for men? In some part, I blame Naruto. A long time ago, back when I was in high school, anime was not cool. I got secondhand embarrassment from my friends in Akatsuki robes, while secretly envying how fucking sick they looked. Since the mid-2010s though, anime's popularity has pierced the heavens. And though I'd love to imagine that millennial anime fans have inexplicably become parents and simply passed on their weebdom, the real reason for the rise might not be that romantic. Keen-eyed observers might have noticed a rise in something else across the globe since the mid-2010s.
Hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia.
You don't fight for your country, you don't push back the invaders, you're not a man.
Capitol Police One advised they're trying to breach and get into the Capitol.
I'm for establishing a strong nationalist Christian-based nation.
I just want to tell you that America is the greatest place on earth. The greatest place on earth. Thank you very much.
While it might seem strange to draw a correlation between the world's rapid cha-cha slide to the far right and anime, the dots aren't too hard to connect. We all love Naruto for how it champions the underdog and showcases the unparalleled powers of friendship. Its nostalgic storylines help soothe the pain of existence, but that soothing might actually be part of the problem. The alt-right's ongoing assault against truth has blurred the lines between fact and fiction, and when national politics become entangled with escapism, it becomes near impossible to generate actual, factual, real-world solutions. Today, I'll be introducing a brief history of nationalisms, their gendered framework, and the unfortunate role shonen anime has played in perpetually reinstitutionalizing patriarchal nationalism. This video was produced in collaboration with Sage's Reign, friend and Naruto aficionado, also creating videos here on YouTube. While my essay analyzes the history of patriarchal nationalism and Naruto's role in perpetuating it, Sage conducts an in-depth review of nationalist themes in Naruto proper, as demonstrated in both character attitudes and village politics. A few relevant videos in his back catalog include the philosophies of the Akatsuki and the philosophy of the first Hokage, a contradiction. For meditations on manga, anime, and more, subscribe to Sage's Reign today. Before we get too far into it, I'd like to remind you all that I am, in fact, a dumb white bitch pretending to know things on the internet. I'm an entertainer, not an educator. I've included citations below for anyone interested in going deeper, so I hope y'all will hold me accountable by furthering the conversation in the comments. My positionality is especially pertinent here because the construct of nationalism I'll be using comes from Western theory, whereas Japan and their cultural products come from, well, Japan. For the purposes of this video, I'm defining nationalism as personal and socio-political ideologies prioritizing national welfare, the status of the so-called nation-state, over individual welfare, the status of individuals comprising it. This allows for a spectrum of nationalism, where some people might prioritize the nation more than others. I'll be arguing that an individual's level of prioritization directly correlates to how much their identity and values are protected, reinforced, or prioritized at the national level. But how exactly does one's personal identity become entangled in national welfare in the first place? As is so commonly the case, we can blame religion. In Imagined Communities, sociologist Benedict Anderson argued that before nationalism, religion helped forge connections between scattered groups of people. Regardless of where they lived, members shared common religious symbols and practices, helping to mitigate other cultural gaps when groups interacted. Religion also imposed a convenient de facto social hierarchy, with people who could read, write, and interpret holy texts positioned closer to divinity than those who couldn't. Immense power was therefore relegated to the church and anyone working closely with them, and this divine power was used to maintain strict class divisions as well as justify colonialism in resource-rich territories, usually all under the guise of saving or civilizing indigenous populations. By the 16th century, the advent of the printing press had made it way easier to produce texts in Europe. However, existing class divisions posed a threat to emerging publishing industries. If books remained exclusively legible to wealthy religious folk, a huge consumer market would remain untapped, the swaths of illiterate masses. Anderson argues that this profit motive inspired a shift in publishing towards using local, vernacular languages. And then came the Enlightenment, when European philosophers started to suggest that all people, not just the rich literate ones, possessed basic human rights and rational faculties. It's estimated that in the 18th century, literacy rates in France doubled as the swaths of formerly illiterate masses began to rally around these ideas. By reading widely circulated stories about daily life, people could sympathize with the lives and experiences of their neighbors in a radically new way. It was this new way of imagining their community that enabled the rapid mobilization of thousands of people for the purposes of revolution. It finally gave them the sense that there were other thousands of people out there to join up with. Solidarity formed between some exploited peoples, ushering in revolutionary projects to liberate some of them from the class hierarchies that oppressed them.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
The American Revolution was somewhat unique for how it insisted that all governing power, not just that of Parliament, should be derived from the people. But who exactly were the people? Peers who spoke the same language, lived a similar life, practiced the same traditions, had the same skin color, and were impacted by the same socio-political events, like taxation. These people formed the people who would eventually become we the people, and this new sense of shared circumstances forged the path through which the individual could identify themselves with the collective. It was this imagined community, this allegedly unified whole, that we now call a nation. It's difficult to identify where in Japanese history this Euro-American model of a nation emerges, largely because, spoiler alert, Japan is not European-American. It's arguable whether a Japanese national identity exists at all, but it especially didn't exist before around 1600 when Tokugawa Ieyasu took full military control of the newly unified feudal domains across the island. Following his clan's ascent to power was a 250-year-long era of relative stability in Japan known as the Tokugawa shogunate, or the Edo period. War-torn chaos between domains prior to unification motivated Tokugawa to expand and militantly enforce isolationist foreign policies collectively known as sakoku. These policies aimed to nullify any threats to the shogun's power, and all other feudal lords, or daimyo, were cut off from any valuable foreign trade that could have helped them finance uprisings. Missionaries and other foreign nationals were expelled or put to death, and Japanese citizens were largely prevented from traveling abroad to curb exposure to Western ideologies. Not all foreign trade was cut off, though. The shogun, some of the other powerful daimyo, and private artisans traded with Chinese, Korean, and Dutch merchants on island trading posts, which were strictly monitored. Under sakoku, Japanese culture had 2.5 centuries to generate and refine itself without much foreign interference.
Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Historians argue that it was America's gunboat diplomacy that shook Japan out of sakoku and into modernity. Lacking new military weaponry and industrial manufacturing, some elites feared Japan was doomed to fall if further threatened by colonial forces. As a result, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, massively expanded foreign trade with the US, UK, France, and Germany through a series of unequal treaties, all in an attempt to beef up the Japanese military. Much of the art, fashion, and craft work that it amassed during the Edo period became Japan's first widely shared exports to Europe in centuries, and this firmly aligned Westerners' understanding of traditional Japanese culture with the Tokugawa shogunate. The depiction of Japanese citizens shaken in the sand under the cannons of Perry's black ships persists to the point of parody. Contemporary theorists problematize this paradigm, though, since it only serves to perpetuate a myth of white Western supremacy. Plenty of people in the middle and lower classes in Japan, under the shogun's increasingly unstable economy, worked to bring financial stability to their villages as best as they could. Like I mentioned, not all foreign trade was cut off prior to 1853. High foreign demand for rice and Edo finery motivated locals to embrace modern farming and manufacturing methods.
So then we can think of a lot of this modernization during the Meiji period as being the product as much of a grassroots movement as something that is imposed top-down from the government.
Yes, Absolutely. There was a famous Japanese historian named Yasumata Yoshio who, in a book on Japan's modernization and popular thought, argued that if you're going to understand the Meiji Restoration and understand Japan's ability to modernize in the late 19th century, you have to look at where the people were, especially where the farmers were. He argues that they developed something he called conventional morality, which emphasized diligence and fortitude and trust. And he said those virtues are really what makes it possible for Japan to industrialize.
Had America not intervened, there were enough revolutionary breadcrumbs to imply that the shogun's power was waning and industrialization was on the horizon. Emperor Meiji's later defeat of the shoguns and subsequent restoration project radically changed how Japanese society was structured. His first order of business was the Charter Oath of 1868, which used language that reads like Enlightenment copypasta. In 1871, the feudal system was abolished in favor of a prefectural one, and social castes were formally dissolved. Finally, in 1889, the Meiji Constitution was adopted, forming the first parliamentary government in Asia and radically democratizing institutions of education, military training, and commerce in Japan. Dr. Ryusuke Maeda of Hokkaido University argues that once the Constitution went into effect in 1890, Japan more or less transitioned into a nation in the Euro-American sense. While nationalism didn't emerge from the same socio-religious frameworks as they did in Europe, inadequacies under the Tokugawa regime gave Meiji's democratic project significant public support. So to summarize, revolutions of the long 19th century produced a nationalist schema previously unimaginable, and one that impacted societies across the globe. Governing institutions became more democratic, whether from the top down or bottom up, to preserve citizens' collective interests. Since then, national interests have been leveraged to justify horrific actions taken by both the United States and Japan. More and more, the impact of prioritizing national welfare has encroached on people's individual liberties, and it's this individual impact that I want to dig into a bit deeper. It goes without saying that imperial nationalism has left a graphic mark on history. The US's colonial legacy in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and Japan's imperial atrocities in China and Korea speak for themselves. After nations were forged, it seems as if their only purpose was to violently expand. Recently, there's been a significant uptick in critical scholarship examining the impact of colonialization on peoples who were colonized. I'll be using the remainder of this video, though, to shift the lens, investigating the effect nationalism has had on the individuals primarily tasked with upholding it: men. Reading through articles on US and Japanese nationalism, men's names, actions, and ideas came up at every juncture. Writing for the Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies in 1998, sociologist Joane Nagle explains how, by definition, nationalism is political and closely linked to the state and its institutions. Like the military, most state institutions have been historically and remain dominated by men. It is therefore no surprise that the culture and ideology of hegemonic masculinity go hand in hand with the culture and ideology of hegemonic nationalism. This framing suggests that over time, the performance of hegemonic masculinity has been inextricably linked to the processes of nation building. Qualities that made a good soldier historically, because women and queer folks were excluded from those institutions, still inform what makes a good man today. Like Jotaro's hair, nationalism and masculinity are two different things, so deeply enmeshed in one another that it's hard to conceive of them as separate entities. For this reason, I argue that men more readily identify and align themselves with issues of national welfare. While the nation suffers, men are both compelled and expected to react in ways that others are not. This framework, what I'll refer to as patriarchal nationalism, puts an undue amount of pressure on males to conform to hegemonic scripts, since their conformity is elevated to a matter of national security. In order to explore the intimate relationship between patriarchy and nationalism, I'll be using examples from one of, if not the most beloved anime franchises of all time, Naruto. Despite being written in the 1990s, its gripping story arcs about overcoming obstacles and the enduring power of friendship entrance teens and young adults to this day. Rewatching the series, though, I was pretty repulsed at how deeply the themes of patriarchal nationalism were embedded into the narrative. And three key themes stood out to me: the demand placed on young boys to discipline their bodies and minds, the instrumental value of emotional relationships, and the necessary role of death. And before you hit send on that comment, yeah, I know, Naruto isn't real. I understand that this is an entertainment franchise targeted at young boys and men. I mentioned at the top of this video that the popularity of anime in recent years has exploded, and although 2008 weeb is delighted, 2024 weeb is frankly terrified. Anime, and especially shonen anime, is a reliable source of gendered fodder that maps conveniently onto our existing frameworks for patriarchal nationalism. All the male characters are strong, stoic protectors, while the women are good wives, mothers, or healers. No matter the reason, no matter the consequences, these kids are willing, ready, and sometimes happy to die for their country. And all in a genre marketed relentlessly at young boys and teens. The fact that none of this is real will be an integral part of a later part of this video, so for now, please just trust the process. Uzumaki Naruto is introduced as a lovable rascal with something to prove. In his debut act, we see him vandalizing the Hokage rock in an effort to get attention, even if it's negative. We learn that he's grown up without parents or friends, ostracized from the village because the weapon of mass destruction sealed into his belly without his consent. Naruto therefore vows to become the Hokage himself one day, committing to the life of a shinobi in order to earn the acceptance and validation of his village. Over the course of the show, Naruto transforms from a goofy underdog into village hero. While the narrative suggests we should celebrate this maturity, this is hard to accept when Naruto isn't really given another option. Despite other career paths seemingly existing in the village, none of them get their heads carved into stone to beckon everyone's praise. And knowing that Naruto is an attention-desperate orphan exiled from the village, it makes sense that he'd be attracted to a role granted that much significance, but that honor comes with a price, namely total conformity of his body and mind into a hegemonic ideal. Initially, Naruto gets picked on for his lack of physical prowess and general buffoonery. Understanding patriarchal nationalism helps explain the excessive scrutiny imposed upon Naruto, his peers, and all men's bodies. A soldier's body must be constantly refined and tested, because at any moment, the enemy could attack, beckoning him to the front lines. If Naruto isn't willing to endure the endless physical judgment, training, and tests, can he really be trusted to protect his country in battle, or serve as Hokage? And remember that his commitment isn't made just in service to national security. As he becomes stronger and more capable, Naruto earns the validation and love of his peers. By performing in alignment with hegemonic expectations, Naruto and all men have to earn their way into society. In the real world, friendship and acceptance is awarded to men who are willing to conform to the roles prescribed to them by patriarchal nationalism. We see other versions of this same trope in characters like Rock Lee and Kakashi. Lee doesn't have any family, ninjutsu, or genjutsu. To compensate for this lack and earn the respect of his peers, he works harder than any other ninja to master his body. His conformity is taken to laughable lengths, dressing up and acting just like his mentor, Guy. The situation is not so comical for Kakashi, who watches his father fall into a suicidal depression after upending a mission to save his comrades. Not wanting to make the same mistake, Kakashi adheres himself strongly to the shinobi code, becoming a top academy student and eventually revered Joane. In all three circumstances, these boys commit their bodies to their village, and the results are all the same, transforming vulnerable youth into willing and capable killing machines. Patriarchal nationalism demands that men sacrifice their individual liberties beginning as early as childhood, as both their ticket to social acceptance and proof of their commitment to national welfare. Just as soon as our yellow-haired hero is getting comfortable with his new buddies on Team 7, his burgeoning skills as a shinobi are tested, not just physically, but emotionally. Having watched his brand new rival throw down his life to protect him, Naruto relays that Rule 25 of the Shinobi Code demands that no matter what, a true shinobi must not show their emotions. Naruto has to find a way to channel his feelings and push forward, and channel he does. Naruto's rage is manipulated by Kurama, who uses it to release some of his own chakra, heal Naruto, and then overwhelm Haku. This is just one example of a classic trope for patriarchal nationalism. Relationships forged by and between men function as the stone by which a soldier's skills are honed. Because men are tools at the state's disposal, their entire lives must function in service to this end, meaning relationships and emotions must also serve the national welfare. The value of heterosexual relationships under this framework is clear. Under patriarchal nationalism, women serve as good wives and wise mothers, comforting their husbands before and after war and raising their sons into loyal patriots. Homosexual relationships, because they don't produce offspring, have a separate function. This is vividly depicted in Naruto and Sasuke's best friend rivalry.
I've had enough of this. What the heck are you? I'm your friend!
Naruto continually refers to Sasuke as his friend, although they're rarely, if ever, seen hanging out or having a good time. Their friendship is instead defined by envy and combativeness. Naruto tests his physical development against Sasuke, and their relationship serves Kahona for how it forces both shinobi to level up into oblivion. The same dynamic is observed between Rock Lee and Neji, Madara and Hashirama, Kakashi and Guy, and pretty much any boy involved in Little League sports. Because male emotions must also serve the state, they can't simply be felt. For example, the profound fear and sadness Sasuke experiences after having witnessed and re-witnessed his parents' slaughter is not meaningfully processed, but instead utilized to unlock his Sharingan. While I'll leave the more in-depth Uchiha character analysis to Sage, I want to highlight this dynamic for how it instrumentalizes love, friendship, and even familial bonds. These relationships are valuable not just in their own right, but for how they'll propel men to new heights once they're inevitably lost. In the aftermath of the Sasuke retrieval arc, Shikamaru experiences a moment of rational self-doubt. Under his leadership, both Neji and Choji were pushed to the brink of death. Unsure whether his friends have survived, he questions whether or not he's cut out for the shinobi life. Rather than provide support or comfort, both his future wife and his father taunt Shikamaru for his unmanly display. Shikaku states that if he ran, his friends would simply die under someone else's watch. If he really cared for them then, Shikamaru would swallow his tears, train harder, and become a stronger leader who could carry his team to success next time around. It's easy to sympathize with Shikamaru, and examining all the pressure and death that a man must be willing to endure, question if it's really all worth it. But it's this exact question that patriarchal nationalism cannot tolerate. Israeli academic Yael Tamir writes,
"The effectiveness of nationalism stems from its transcendence of contingency, shifting finite human actions to the realm of the eternal. As long as the nation endures, it will show gratitude to all who struggle and sacrifice their lives for its survival. It will turn them into heroes, perhaps canonize them, even if they come from vile or ignoble background."
And it's true. Soldiers who've died in the line of duty both in the United States and Japan are viewed solemnly as dignified servants who gave the ultimate sacrifice for their country. No matter why they risked their lives, no matter how senseless the mission was, all questions stop out of respect for the dead. But honor in death only exists when there's a nation willing to honor it. Meaning, if Shikamaru were to ignore his father and leave the shinobi life, he'd threaten the legitimacy of the system that gives meaning to all deaths. Any deviant must fall back in line, be exiled, or be killed, lest their example inspire future deviations, unraveling the nation from within. Death is simultaneously the most honorable sacrifice a man can make, and the only path out for a man who can't endure. Sakumo went against mission orders to save his teammates. The mission's failure had severe repercussions for the village, but more than that, Sakumo's actions put his individual interests over national welfare. The village, including his teammates, deemed him a traitor, since his deviancy threatened the very fabric of the nation. Losing the relationships he aimed to save, Sakumo fell into a depression that eventually led to his suicide. While Shisui's story is different, it ends the same. A soldier who refused to accept the code of patriarchal nationalism is forced to end his life for lack of any other path forward. Seeking peace between the Uchiha and the Leaf Village, Shisui agrees to use his Sharingan to subdue the Uchiha coup d'etat, but diplomacy has no place under patriarchal nationalism, which grounds itself instead in power and domination. Realizing that neither Uchiha leadership nor Danzo would accept a peaceful resolution, Shisui drowns himself in the Naka River. For both Shisui and Sakumo, it was easier to die than live under conditions that their individual values deeply contradicted. And it's not just within the village. Death follows any shinobi who leaves their village under irregular circumstances. Not only do their bodies contain village intel, but the mere existence of another path threatens hegemonic order. The logic of nationalism has to be this way in order to rationalize the death the nation itself causes. If anyone had the option to live however they pleased, there'd be no nation to valorize all of the men who'd already fallen in line, who'd made those sacrifices. No reason for the sacrifices you'd already made. If and only if the nation endures, it will show gratitude to all who struggle and sacrifice their lives for its survival. Returning to my comment section's favorite point, Naruto isn't real. It's a made-up world of magical ninja that exists to entertain us. But Naruto succeeds at entertaining us because its characters are relatable. They, like us, live under the constraints of patriarchal nationalism. Men in the Leaf Village must also conform to very specific ideals in order to be accepted by their peers, sacrifice intimacy in favor of competition, and suppress their emotions, warping them instead into motivation for vengeance. The enduring charm of shonen anime, and most contemporary media targeting young men and boys, comes not from subverting these constraints, but through letting them play out fantastically, because ultimately, that's what patriarchal nationalism is. One big, imagined fantasy. As I've covered before, male suicide rates have outpaced femmes since these statistics have been documented. Despite the dramatic differences in our two cultures, these trends are similarly persistent in Japan. While the violence and oppression of gender non-conforming folks and women is maybe too well documented, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the first you've heard these statistics about men. If you are familiar with these numbers, though, you've probably heard them from the mouths of an alarmist Roganite decrying our contemporary quote-unquote crisis of masculinity. And yes, I'll admit, we as a country are facing a crisis of masculinity. Unlike Sharknado might have you believe, manhood isn't being eroded or somehow disappearing. No. As long as we have people who identify as men, we'll have masculinity. Rather, our crisis comes from the fact that the super soldier nation-building version of masculinity that's historically defined our institutions has become all but irrelevant in our current day. Across the first world, masks are rapidly having to adjust to societies in which national welfare relies far less on their physical strength and willingness to die, and far more on technology, diplomacy, and economic sanctions. Japan was forced to demilitarize after World War II, and while under American occupation, had to dramatically shift their economic priorities away from their military and into agricultural and technological trades. In the United States, we've moved to a largely privatized model for national security. While back home, veteran stories from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have radically challenged our traditionally romantic views of war. Both the US and Japan have seen a significant decline in voluntary military recruitment and retention as of late, suggesting that men might be losing interest in military institutions altogether. Simultaneously, both countries have somewhat successfully integrated women into the workforce. And in a capitalist globalist economy where GDP is as defining a feature of a nation as its military, this integration has threatened the chokehold men used to have over nation building. All of these rapid and recent renegotiations beg a set of complex questions. Who is the ideal man in a post-nationalist world, and what can he contribute to society? Do we still need the oppressive scrutiny over male bodies and masculine performance if military service isn't super relevant anymore? And if the skills necessary to maintain the strength of a nation have become gender neutral, do we even need gender roles anymore? Ideally, the answer to these questions would come from experimenting with new ideologies and institutions, perhaps in a space where the limits of physical reality are moot, and stunning visual storytelling can propel audiences towards solutions beyond what they'd initially thought possible. But rather than experimental, creative, or innovative depictions of nationalism and masculinity, popular culture constantly uplifts fictional worlds where gender roles are predictable and man's role in society is clear and distinct. This creates an exhausting paradox where the entertainment boys and men use to escape from reality only perpetuate the very lifestyles they yearn to escape from. Viewers are never presented with a practical answer to the question of why patriarchal nationalism must persist. It just has to. Otherwise, its senseless circular logic would come into sharp focus, and men would not only have to grapple with their position in reality, but accept that all of the discipline and emotional suppression they've endured has been in service to a fantasy. We see the same emphasis on circular logic within alt-right ideologies across the globe. It should come as no surprise that anime's rise has coincided with the rise of the far right. Just like shonen anime, their political fiction aims to soothe growing anxieties about men's place in the modern world, reassuring followers that it's not them, but the rest of reality that's flawed. Conspiracy theorists and alt-right ideologues are successful because they tap into hegemonic tropes, presenting them as familiar, quick, and easy fixes to the world's problems. As long as patriarchal nationalism exists, men have an excuse for the senseless violence they both create and must suffer. Some other nation, the enemy, is to blame. And as soon as we overcome the enemy, things will be great again. Just like Shikaku, conservative leaders tout that the solution to all of our problems is to do the same things we've always done, but harder, better, faster, stronger. Endure the grief and trauma. It'll make you a better man. And if you can't endure it, that's okay. The nation doesn't need weak men, and your comrades will be strengthened by your honorable exit. But honor in death is nothing more than an afterthought, bestowed on the dead to try and rationalize the impossible. None of the hard work of nation building is done by dead men. It's the living who are left to answer the radically complex and practical questions of maintaining a nation. While I don't mean to disparage the memories of citizens who've given their lives, I find it necessary to call into question a system that would so fervently socialize men into this suicidal mindset. If we truly want to honor the dead, perhaps we should start by dismantling the systems that rushed them and so many others to an early grave. Hashirama and Madara initially envisioned the Leaf Village as a land where young children didn't have to spend their lives training and fighting and dying for their clans. The nation was supposed to be a space where friends could flourish without worrying about having to bury one another, to which I say, well, what the fuck happened? It mirrors how the revolutionary promises of the long 19th century have fallen far short of their own potential. This village, these nations, have only produced generational cycles of violence. It's absolutely infuriating. Why can't there be peace in the shinobi world? Just shut up and watch these sick-ass fights. As demonstrated by Hashirama and Madara's ambitions, there's nothing inherently wrong with nationalism. Having a community of people governed in such a way that preserves their way of life is common sense. Similarly, there's nothing inherently wrong with men or masculinity, but things start to go awry when men become socialized to believe that they must perform a certain way if they and their community is to survive. When the very essence of a nation becomes intertwined with an inflexible set of member expectations, that nation is doomed to fail, if for no other reason than that time marches on. Our nations have transformed, and their ideological underpinnings can now only flourish in fiction. But fiction shouldn't function to preserve the past. Radical imagination should be applied radically in service to innovative ideological transformation that will realign our individual realities with national priorities.
To truly protect and honor the emotional lives of boys, we must challenge patriarchal culture. And until that culture changes, we must create the subcultures, the sanctuaries where boys can learn to be who they are uniquely, without being forced to conform to patriarchal masculine visions. To love boys rightly, we must value their inner lives enough to construct worlds, both private and public, where their right to wholeness can be consistently celebrated and affirmed, where their need to love and be loved can be fulfilled.
This is the only future for both nationalism and masculinity, a future where they're divorced from rigid expectations and free to respond creatively and fluidly to the world around them. So viva la anime revolution! Burn it all to the ground and build back better, but like, for real this time. We can do it. We are the fact.